She is 573 feet long, weighs 27,000 tons. She once was the most powerful ship in the world. She served in 2 world wars, fought the Germans and the Japanese. Now she is facing what may be her final battle, a battle to survive. She is the USS Texas. This is the story of a battleship, a war wagon, born in a different time, an era when a powerful navy was all important, a time when whoever ruled the waves ruled the world, a time when the strength of a nation was measured in battleships. The story of the Texas begins in the early years of the 20th century and continues today because her very life is threatened by time, by disrepair, by neglect. The ship now belongs to Texas, to Texans. She is, like our state, unique. The last battleship of her era anywhere in the world. She is the last of her breed. The Texas is a dreadnought modeled after Britain's HMS Dreadnought.
In 1905, I believe it was, they launched Dreadnought. She was completed shortly afterwards, and she incorporated a number of improvements, an all-big gun main battery, and also turbine engines in place of the reciprocating piston engines that had been used in big ships up until that time. Theodore Roosevelt built up the Navy, not because he had the slightest desire to go to war with anybody, but simply because he realized that it was getting to be that kind of a world. The fangs and the claws and the talons were getting longer and sharper, and there were a lot of them out there. And he realized very well that diplomacy and polite conversation was all very well, but it had to be backed up with something.
England, Germany, and France were edging toward war when the keel of the Texas was laid in 1911. Congress had approved $6 million to build the battleship. Workers at the Newport News shipyard in Virginia spent 2 years forging and riveting the Texas hull. She was involved in controversy even before she was launched. Prohibition wasn't law yet, but the influence of Carrie Nation and others was already being uncorked in Texas. The Texas Women's Christian Union petitioned the Navy to christen the battleship Texas with water, but the Navy ruled for champagne. May 18th, 1912, a day Eurolink Eckhart recalls well. She was a maid of honor at the ship's launching.
When it's just a hull when they launch it, all the top part and all the silverware they put in, everything later has not been added to it at that time. We went down on the boat, as I said, with the Secretary of the Navy and the President's daughter and several other notables who were on that boat with us, and we weren't interested in that part. We were interested in being entertained by all these young men in the Army and Navy.
It was almost 2 years before the battleship was completely fitted out, guns in place, ready for action. Her 10 14-inch guns made her, when she was commissioned, the most formidable sea warrior on Earth, with more firepower than any other ship afloat. And this was crucial to the role the United States was beginning to play on the world political stage.
The U.S. Navy was not the world's most powerful navy. There were those who argued that, of course, as there always had been right back to the early days of the Republic. There were those who argued that we did need a strong navy, a strong seagoing navy. There were others who felt that what we needed was primarily a area defense force.
Battleships are gun platforms, and they are also symbols of a nation's power. And the first appearance of the Battleship Texas on the world scene was in the power role. It was in the spring of 1914. She was just out of the shipyard. She hadn't even started her sea trials yet when President Woodrow Wilson ordered the Texas to join the Atlantic Fleet here at Veracruz. The Mexican rebels, led by Victoriano Huerta, had assassinated President Francisco Madero and seized power in Mexico City. There were counter-revolutionaries and bandits prowling the countryside. President Wilson was concerned about the safety of Americans living and working in Mexico, and he was worried, too, about possible connections between Huerta and Germany. He wanted Huerta out. The British and the French and the Germans all had interests to protect here, too. And this bay off Veracruz was full of warships from all 4 nations. And the mightiest ship out there was the new USS Texas. She never fired a shot here. She didn't need to. The United States Marines had already seized the harbor and the old fort and the city of Veracruz before the Texas arrived. Huerta was eventually forced out and succeeded by Venustiano Carranza. This arrangement suited Woodrow Wilson a lot better, and the Texas wasn't needed here anymore. There were American casualties, though. Some were brought aboard the Texas and returned to New York for memorial services. The Texas then sailed from New York for her delayed sea trials, and her initiation was successful. Flank speed registered at 21 knots. Her gunnery marks were outstanding. The E for excellence would become a fixture on her smokestack, a trademark for years to come. The Texas again steamed south into the Gulf of Mexico in September of 1914 and made her first visit to her namesake state, docking at Galveston. Governor O.B. Colquitt presided over ceremonies where Waco businessmen presented the officers of the Texas with a lavish silver service, a gift from Texas to the Texas. The Texas Oil Company had a gift for the crewmen, a living mascot, a bear cub named Ursa. The next several months were spent honing those skills a battleship and her crew would need in war. The inevitable was creeping closer. The Allies and Germany already were slugging it out in Europe. 20th century technology was being introduced into war. The tank was developed to support the infantry. Dirigibles spied on troop movements, although they were vulnerable to attack. Chemical warfare had started. War at sea was changing too, away from surface battles and towards surprise submarine attacks. The British kept the Kaiser's surface ships bottled up in the North Sea, blockaded into impotence. The only way the Germans could wage war at sea was with submarines, and their U-boats played havoc with Allied convoys in the North Atlantic.
The Germans thought in terms of, by the time we got onto World War I, we're thinking in terms of the submarine, which was, a natural weapon for in a naval war for the power that does not have a large surface battle fleet to challenge the other side in a toe-to-toe, knock-down, drag-out naval action.
The London Treaty of 1910 had set down rules for the sinking of merchant ships in time of war. The crew and the passengers had to be given an opportunity to abandon ship, and only after they were safely off could their vessel be sunk. The German U-boat skippers obeyed that treaty for a time, but not a long time.
At the same time, the British Admiralty was issuing orders to its merchant captains. You must send off a radio message the minute a submarine spots you. You have no discretion in the matter. You must attempt to resist. They were directing the captains of their merchant ships, for example, to attempt to ram.
U.S. supplies were critical to the Allied war effort even before America entered the war officially. Many American merchant ships were armed because of the U-boats. 5 of the Battleship Texas 5-inch guns were taken off and installed on merchant ships. The Texas was ready for war by the fall of 1917, barely 4 months after President Woodrow Wilson had led America into the contest with Germany. The British were low on oil by 1917, so when we sent warships over, the Navy picked the coal burners to go. The Texas left for the war zone from New York in September. The captain and the navigator had both been newly assigned to the ship, and neither one of them had had a whole lot of recent sea duty. But they got the Texas safely through Long Island Sound, and they were negotiating the channel between Block Island here and the coast of Rhode Island when things started to go wrong. It was dark, there was a minefield to be avoided, there were only a few lights to navigate by, and the officers of the Texas got confused. The battleship crashed into Block Island, and those rocks out there tore a hole at least 100 feet long in her outer hull.
I lay down on the deck where I wouldn't be trod on, and I felt the ship slowing down. I seemed to be sliding along the deck. And then they sounded the general alarm, which was a series of, they had single-stroke bells, and they was clanging away all over the ship.
It took the crew 3 days to unload the ship and lighten her enough to get her off those rocks over there. And she was in no condition then, of course, to go to war. She went back to New York for repairs. The Texas was laid up in dry dock. The Navy was busy with the war, but not too busy to convene a board of inquiry to determine responsibility for the Texas gashed hull.
The commanding officer is always responsible, because he has total responsibility for that ship and everything that happens to it.
But Captain Victor Blue was let off the hook. Navigator Frank Martin took the official blame for the grounding. The Texas was ready for war again 4 months after the accident. She left New York on a snowy day in January of 1918.
Some of the sprinters froze waiting to see the Statue of Liberty. I guess a lot of fellows wondered if they'd see it again.
The winter crossing was a rough one for the Texas and her crew. A huge storm churned up the North Atlantic.
But we were informed that if we did go over the side, it was our hard luck, because they didn't stop the ship, pick anybody up. They'd pie for a submarine. We kept 19, 18, 19 knots all the time.
The Texas joined the British Grand Fleet soon after that, ready to battle the elements and the German high seas fleet. The British fleet the Texas was attached to was based at 2 harbors in Scotland, on the edge of the North Sea, Scapa Flow to the north and the Firth of Forth near Edinburgh. The Texas did mostly patrol duty in company with the British ships. This required the crew of the Texas to learn the systems of His Majesty's Navy.
They had to get used to British, of course, operational and signals. This can sometimes cause a problem when ships of 2 nations are operating together, because their operational procedures, even their vocabulary is different.
The British blockade of the German surface fleet had been effective since the Battle of Jutland in 1915, but the Grand Fleet and the Texas had to be ready, ever alert, in case the Germans made a run for the open waters of the North Atlantic. The Texas would be a prize for the Kaiser's gunners, so she was often sent dangerously close to the German fleet in an effort to lure the Germans into battle.
We acted really as bait to the Germans to get them to come out, but they didn't.
This is a fairly common notion. You send a portion of your force out to squirm and wiggle and act alive, and in hope that the other fellow will take the bait and come out after them.
The Germans never took the bait, but their U-boats sometimes prowled very close to the Grand Fleet and the usually well-protected Texas.
One time, it was unusual. It was just like glass, you see the wake of all the ships, and I found a place in the water where it came to a V. It had to originate there. And I called the officer's attention to it, and while they were wondering what it was, the destroyer, we had destroyers with us. Their job was to shoo away the submarines. We didn't chase any of it. We got away. Anyhow, they turned around up depth charge, and so I guess maybe there was something that...
Contacts with the enemy, though, were the exception rather than the rule. The Texas was occupied with practicing gunnery rituals during most of her time in the war zone. The war at sea continued to be a relatively quiet cat-and-mouse game. It was a submarine war. The Grand Fleet's surface blockade was working. The land war was another story. More than 2 million American soldiers, doughboys, and a few women were sent to Europe. More troops were being trained for General Blackjack Pershing's expeditionary force. Replacements were a necessity of war. North Sea patrol duty had become routine for the Texas, too routine for some.
Boredom. Well, it was the most boring thing in the world. You'd be up in Scapa Flow.
It was very rugged duty. There wasn't any USO back in those days. We were operating out of a very bleak base. It was very rugged duty, I say, especially in winter, which was long and very bitter up there. The North Sea apparently is a very inhospitable body of water. And of course, there was always the threat of enemy presence.
The crew found ways to help relieve the boredom and tension. 5 laps around the deck, the Texas Mile. And showtime on the deck often produced strange sights. Outrageous skits performed by crewmen were a long-standing rite of the sea. The curtain came down in the European theater in November of 1918. Germany surrendered, and the Texas escorted the captured German fleet into port, eventually to Scapa Flow, Scotland. The Allies were ready for any German tricks on the way.
They went out in 2 lines, 6 miles apart, when the Germans were to come down the middle. We had armor-piercing shells right on the tray there, ready to ram into the guns. If they'd just started something, it would have been too bad because they'd got it from two sides.
The Germans did have one last trick, though. They anchored at Scapa Flow and then scuttled their entire fleet.
They were still salvaging them as late as World War II. I understand at least some of them are still in the bottom over there at Scapa Flow. It's a massive salvage job.
World War I was over for the Texas, her days with the Grand Fleet at an end.
It was a gray, chilly day, and they lined up on the rail and gave us 3 cheers, you know, and played Old Lang Syne. Every time I hear that.
The Texas found a niche in naval aviation history. Next, she was the first American ship to have a Sopwith Camel spotter plane launched from one of her gun turrets. The Texas also served as a spotter for the first transatlantic flight by a seaplane. That was in May of 1919, and the Navy seaplane averaged 76 miles an hour crossing the Atlantic. It would be the airplane that would cause the battleships to lose to the aircraft carriers, their role as the mainstay of the fleet, but that wouldn't happen till years later. The Texas next steamed through the Panama Canal for duty in the Pacific. Locations change, but a seaman's chores never do.
I was just a deckhand, a swab jockey, so to speak, and I started off from there. But it didn't take me long. The old pay scale of $21 a month, you didn't get money enough to get too much trouble. They started gambling, and I think I was in the second group. I shot a little gap. I didn't have enough to hurt me if I lost it anyway.
Keeping the battle wagon clean was a full-time job for the crew. Handling and burning coal makes a mess.
Many aspects of it were not exactly fun. Coal had to be taken aboard literally by hand. Coaling ship had to be done periodically, and it was, from all descriptions, it was something that nobody looked forward to.
When you did coal ship, you go to the bathroom to clean up, you know. You take clean underwear and hang them up on the steam light or something. That when you got ready to go, they're disappeared to you. Somebody else would have them.
The war was over, but the hazards of sea duty were not. Harry Farmer was on duty when the Texas got involved in a collision off the coast of California.
We went right and she went left, and we just kind of sideswiped. But it took all of our rigging, lifeboat, and all the radio stuff up above. It was falling on deck, and there's a few men trying to get on the hatch, but there's so many on deck that they couldn't anybody get on.
The days of the coal burners were numbered. Government leaders after the war were looking for ways to cut the defense budget.
Well, the early post-war years were very, very tight. Money was practically non-existent. Well, Congress took the attitude, look, this is the war, you just fought the war to end wars and it's over. Well, the coal burner was becoming a relic. The advantages and the simplicity of oil fuel were making themselves felt. And also another thing that it would appeal very much to a Navy that was operating on a tight personnel budget. There were never enough people to go around. You could run an oil-burning engineering plant with a much smaller number of people.
World naval power was limited by the Washington Treaty following World War I, and 4 of the Texas sister dreadnoughts were sent to the scrap heap. Things looked pretty bad for the increasingly obsolete coal burners. But refitting the Texas was cheaper than building a new oil burner, and this option appealed to Congress in the austere days of the 20s. So the Texas sailed back to the place of her birth, Newport News, Virginia, in 1925, to be worked over. And she was reborn as an oil-burning battle wagon 2 years later.
Within the limits of money and technology, okay, we always have to say that. She was a much better ship, yes, than she had been when she went into the yard.
The cage masts were replaced by sturdier tripod masts. Torpedo blisters were added to the hull, and a permanent seaplane catapult was installed on top of the midships turret.
The principal purpose, reason for carrying these things on board battleships was reconnaissance and gunfire spotting. I think everybody involved realized that the airplane was on its way as a new weapon.
Aircraft carriers would upstage her later, but the Battleship Texas at this time was considered the finest ship in the Navy. She was chosen as flagship of the United States fleet. Peacetime duty meant fleet maneuvers and especially gunnery practice. Machines are only as good as the men using them. The Texas also took thousands of Naval Academy cadets on their ritual summer cruises. The men in this case were only as good as the machine they used.
In those days, they seemed to have been the pretty standard practice to send new ensigns to sea as junior officers on board battleships, with the idea that they would be formed and trained there before they were, and to make them fully ready for other types of duty in other ships later on.
Japan was flexing her muscle in the 1930s. The Japanese invaded Manchuria and then China, and eventually they bombed Hong Kong. The Japanese also were building up a formidable carrier fleet to help expand the empire's influence throughout the Pacific. Germany, on the other side of the world, was ignoring the treaties that were supposed to limit armaments. The Germans were building submarines again. England was once again pushed into war when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. There was a good deal of sentiment in the United States to stay out of that conflict. World War I was still fresh in many minds. But the crises in Asia and Europe saved the Texas from the scrap heap. She'd been scheduled for retirement in 1938. She was fitted out instead with the first experimental radar, and she joined several other American ships on neutrality patrols in the North Atlantic. They escorted British convoys from North American waters halfway across the Atlantic, where British planes took over the escort duty.
There was a fear that the surface war might spill over into the Western Atlantic.
The Texas entered the German blockade zone off Britain once and got spotted by a U-boat. The United States was still officially neutral, and the submarine commander was denied permission to attack the Texas. It left him wondering.
The commanding officer of the U-boat made some rather puzzled entries. You know, what's going on here? Have they sold Texas to the English? In other words, like, what's going on? Why is she up here? What's happening? What is this all about? So there was a certain amount of confusion.
To compound the confusion over which ship belonged to whom, the U.S. lent the British 50 destroyers. All of this caused critics to claim the neutrality patrol was not neutral. Patrol duty sometimes put the Texas in strange waters. She was anchored off the small town of Conway, Newfoundland, one Christmas, and the whole town came aboard for Christmas dinner and a movie. It was the first movie any of the townspeople there had seen.
We're not talking many people. I don't remember how many. Maybe 20, 30, 40. There wasn't too many.
World events took a really dramatic turn shortly afterward. The Texas was in safe harbor at Portland, Maine, 5,000 miles away, on the 7th of December in 1941, when Japanese pilots were being briefed on their next mission. The mission that would change the course of history. The target, the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor.
This program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
We have but two choices today, either to fight or to surrender. And America, thank God, has never surrendered and never will.
The Texas was assigned to protect troop and supply convoys from the German U-boats in the North Atlantic.
We were more or less offering protection to the convoys, but we, at the same time, the Germans had superiority of the underwaters, if nothing else, in those days. And the German wolf packs, as they recall, were taking more than their toll. And we started staying away. We were escorting them a little bit, then we started staying away from the convoys because, as I say, we were attracting too much attention to our own self.
North Atlantic was awfully rough. Not for us, we got used to it. A lot of soldiers on these transports, they would get sick. I mean, the whole outfit would get sick. And it's a terrible sickness.
The Navy embarked on a building program to replace the ships lost at Pearl Harbor and in subsequent battles. The first time the great guns of the Texas fired on the enemy was in November of 1942. This was Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. The mission was to cut Germany's desert commander Erwin Rommel off from his supply lines. The British hit North Africa from the Mediterranean. The U.S. operation concentrated on Morocco. It was under the control of French forces cooperating with the Germans. The Allies hoped to turn the French against the Nazis.
We had a broadcasting station on the ship, and one of the officers could speak French fluently, and he broadcast to the people over there that we would invade their shores, a friendly group of people, and ask them to not resist, that we wasn't there to fight them, but they did resist for a while.
The Texas guns covered the Marines' landing, and for the first time, U.S. Navy guns were trained on inland targets. Shells from the Texas guns hit an ammunition dump and an armored troop column, and her reputation as the sharpshooter of the fleet was sustained.
We had a soldier come aboard ship with the general a couple of days later, and he was talking to us sailors on the quarterdeck, telling us that that's what blew the tanks out of the area, and then they took Fort Leone pretty easy.
The older battleships, Texas and all of her generation, they weren't fast enough to chase around with the carriers, but they were perfectly good enough to provide heavy gunfire support for landing operations, and we could see that both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific this was going to be an amphibious war.
Most of the newer, faster battleships like the North Carolina went to the Pacific to escort aircraft carriers. The Texas returned to patrol duty in the Atlantic, a floating steel city with a population of almost 2,000.
It was just so crowded. There was just hardly a square inch where there wasn't somebody living. I used to sleep on this desk, and all I had was about a 2-inch thick straw-filled mattress and no pillow, and of course I had 2 wool blankets. But sometimes when I'd turn over, my shoulder would catch underneath here. So that's where I slept.
But the battleship has everything. We have library, we have movies, we have haircuts, barbershops. We can buy anything we want to. And when we went ashore across the seas, of course, you were told in no uncertain terms. Like, for instance, went to Belfast, Ireland. They say, look, the liquor here is potent. The venereal disease is rampant, and it have all these warnings for you.
It's who you knew. You know, you wanted to go to the tailor to get a stripe or whatever. You know, you go to the tailor. Yeah, give him a few bucks.
He said, "Oh, you're the tailor." Said the tailor and the barber, only 2 people never cashed their never had to cash their check.
A lot of guys didn't want to go on liberty, so we would pay them to take their liberty spot. One night would be port, one day would be port, and the other day would be starboard.
They didn't allow gambling on ship, but there was quite a bit of going on. And they had mastered arms, which are police of the ship, and they put a stop to the thing when they're going wrong, but there's no drinking when you're at sea.
When we were in port, we're safe enough to know, we would have movies every night on the forecastle or the front of the ship, you know, front bow, and everybody would bring them a bucket, something to sit on.
We had a little band. We used to get together. You know, I played the guitar, and the band, part of the band, would get together, and we'd go down the hole somewhere and we'd just, you know, entertain ourselves, dance, you know, even against a post or something, you know, jitterbug and whatever.
There were other times when the tedium of war was relieved by music. A USO troupe came aboard to perform a new musical called Oklahoma.
I'm in a terrible fix. I always say, come on, let's go. Just when I ought to say nix.
The invasion of Italy in September of 1943 gave the Allied forces their first toehold on the continent of Europe. The U-boat menace in the Atlantic was under control by early 1944. The Allies were able to focus most of their attention on liberating Europe. A career Army man from Texas commanded the complex effort called Operation Overlord. He was General Dwight Eisenhower. The scale of Overlord was unprecedented, and the battleship Texas had a key role. There had been months of preparation, from mock invasions on the shores of Maryland to transporting hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of planes and ships to staging areas in England. Eisenhower and Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw the expedition off. Eisenhower boarded the Texas to inspire the crew and take care of some last-minute business.
He come aboard ship to have conference with his Allied commanders, and he said during that visit he chose the Texas because that was the state of his birth.
He said that they can furnish us the materials and the strategy and all this and that and other, but we're the ones going to have to win the battle, you know. The world's is dependent on us to do the job. That is the sailors aboard in the battleship.
He wasn't stuffy or anything pompous or anything like that, but he was just really cheering us on.
Oh, and he come right to us and started shaking hands, asking the crew where they were from, and he asked me, he said, "Where are you from, son?" I said, "Oklahoma." He said, "Well, fine, that's between the two best states in the Union. I was born in Texas and raised in Kansas."
LeGrand Moody was a chaplain on board the Texas.
Of course, you've heard there are no atheists in foxholes, and the Sunday before we had the invasion and the Sunday morning that we went to the Battle of Cherbourg, I had more people in church than I ever had at any other time.
Everyone was given an opportunity to prepare the wheel. They didn't expect the Texas to come out of it.
June 6, 1944, the wait was over. The invasion force headed for a stretch of beach on the Normandy coast to catch the Germans off guard.
When I was a kid, there were so many vessels there, we think you could have walked across the English Channel.
It was just ships everywhere. And then, of course, the Air Force was coming over, and they started their bombing, and it was devastating. We were shooting at gun emplacements, etc., and the Army and our spotters from the air gave us our targets.
I remember one time I was down on the second deck up forward, and we fired a salvo, and several of the office doors flew open in the blast, even down below.
Each time those big guns fired, where I was in my position, I was just completely covered with this ring of fire.
The blast going out over the fantail of the ship, and it set some of the canvas on fire that had been used to cover up the anti-aircraft guns.
Hundreds and hundreds of ships. And each ship, those landing craft would carry about 150 men. And of course the worst thing was when those shells hit those ships, there were 150 men. And that happened quite a bit.
They didn't take too many prisoners, but they had a few. And they brought the few of them aboard. And this particular one, as soon as he reached the deck of the ship, he just passed out from terror and seasickness. He was scared to death. He didn't know what was going to happen to him.
We did bring some German prisoners aboard ship at Normandy that had been captured. They were about 14, 15, 16-year-old kids that had been conscripted, and they were brought aboard for interrogation just for a few hours, and then they were taken off to a prisoner camp. Well, I thought to myself, is this the super race that we're supposed to be fighting?
All those hours of practice paid off for the crew of the Texas. The ship was credited with knocking out several Nazi gun emplacements and pillboxes. She also lobbed shells inland to disable German positions in the surrounding towns and help Allied paratroopers and ground troops liberate them. The invasion was going well, but the price was high.
For 75 yards on that beach, men were stacked up like cordwood, and they were in rigor mortis. And they weren't sewed up in canvas, and it was just the most horrible sight I ever saw.
The Normandy coast was under siege for more than 2 weeks. The Texas was ordered to help capture the French port of Cherbourg. And the Germans had 2 big guns at Cherbourg with even more range than the guns on the Texas. The ship's chaplain was on the PA system, describing the battle action to the men on duty below decks.
We just had a near miss on the starboard side.
When Cherbourg was firing at us, we could hear the shells hitting the water exploding.
One of the yeomen on the ship who takes notes for the captain, he puts it down shorthand, he looked at me and just as plain as day said, he said, the next one is ours. And bam, we got hit.
That shell that came in and hit the top of the conning tower. The whole force of that 11-inch shell came up into the deck of the bridge and just folded those half-inch steel plates up just like a sardine can would be opened up. Everything went black, and I think I must have blacked out for just a moment.
Then the smoke cleared. The first person I saw was Padre Moody, Chaplain LeGrand Moody, and he was in a dazed condition.
And I said, Edelman, come here and help me with this man. There was a man maybe 4 or 5 feet from me over there, and he was looking and he was saying, Chaplain, Chaplain, help me, my legs are gone.
My tibias and fibulas went through the base of my feet, pushed out my ankles, pushed out my insteps, my heels. My back was broken in numerous places. Deck plates tore across my chest and crushed my chest and tore my chest all up. I then was blown up and hit the overhead. My skull was fractured very, very severely.
I did go down to the first aid station, and the deck was just running with blood.
The toll from one German 280mm shell, 1 dead, 13 injured. The Texas continued to fire at the German guns for 2 hours after she was hit. She was finally ordered to break off the engagement and head for Plymouth, England for repairs, and it was discovered there that a second German shell had penetrated the Texas bow and fallen into a space directly below the wardroom. It was a dud, fortunately. The Texas sailed 3 weeks later for the Mediterranean to take part in the invasion of southern France, again providing fire support for the troops landing on the beaches. The landing forces met much less resistance here, and the operation was an easy success. The Texas took time out for repairs and then headed for action in the Pacific. This was a different kind of war. The aircraft carrier was the key element. The battleships had to provide anti-aircraft protection for the carriers as well as fire support for troop landings. The Japanese were the toughest opponents the United States Navy ever faced. Chester Nimitz of Texas was in charge of our Pacific Fleet, and his forces were helping to push the Japanese back toward their homeland. The Texas' first action came at Iwo Jima. The Japanese had dug themselves in, thousands of them in tunnels and bunkers underground. Shells from the Texas helped to rout them out, allowing American troops eventually to take the island. Many of the Texas crewmen watched from the ship's deck as a small band of Marines raised our flag on Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi.
It was just a tremendous boost and encouragement to us. I think a lot of us just cheered.
The Texas next fought closer to Japan at Okinawa. The crew ate and slept at general quarters for 50 days, shelling the island and waiting for the kamikaze attacks.
This guy was really, you know, almost on top of us. And we got him. Yeah.
Suicide attacks by the Japanese, and it really made you respect some of those people because they had a faith, you know, that it was strong. And at the same time, though, you were scared of it, and they'd dive on the ships, and luckily we never did get hit.
The Texas fired 4 shiploads of ammunition. Okinawa was captured at a cost of 30 ships sunk, more than 300 damaged. More than 12,000 Americans died here and more than 30,000 were wounded. The war was over soon after. Japan surrendered shortly after we dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Texas work was done. America celebrated the end of the war, but when the cheering stopped, aging warriors lost their appeal. The Texas was 33 years old, a relic from a time gone by. The Navy started planning for the 3rd time to turn the Texas into scrap, and she was not the first war hero the Navy had wanted to scrap. This is one of the most famous warships in our history, but not everybody thought she was worth saving. This is the ship they called Old Ironsides because British cannonballs bounced off that oak hull in the War of 1812. She's the USS Constitution, and she was neglected and allowed to fall into disrepair after that war was over, and barely 25 years after she won the admiration of Americans, she was almost sent to the scrapyard. A poem Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. wrote about her helped persuade Americans that she should be saved.
In September of 1830, Holmes wrote that famous poem, and the public really rallied behind it.
No poet saved the Texas. School children gave pennies and nickels. The Gold Star mothers and Texans generally pitched in to bring our ship home. A radio campaign helped.
This proud ship has not only valiantly carried the name of Texas from the shores of Normandy to the beaches of Okinawa, as only a true Texan could, with dignity and pride, but also that this ship, like the USS Constitution, represents a symbol and a symbol of freedom and a dream of democracy.
Admiral Nimitz saw to it that the Texas would be ours. She was commissioned as the flagship of the Texas Navy at the San Jacinto battleground on the 21st of April, 1948.
So today, gallant old ship, we say to you, hail and farewell. We will never forget your long and faithful service.
We pray thee now, O God, that this, our ship, as it embarks upon a new career, may always and forever be a monument to patriotism, to freedom, and to the sacredness and dignity of human life.
I love the Texas. I always have.
The Texas was placed under the care of the Battleship Texas Commission when she came here to stay in 1948. The commission planned to pay for her upkeep with admission fees and concession profits. The revenues didn't come up to expectations sometimes, and sometimes there were disagreements about how the money that did come in should be spent. So the ship that was the pride of Texas didn't always get the care she deserved. The Battleship Commission eventually was abolished, and the ship now is under the care of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Many other dreadnoughts did end up on the scrap heap. The Texas sister ship, the New York, and some of the others were used as targets in atomic bomb tests in the 1950s. The Texas today is a treasure trove of history.
Aluminum over galvanized steel.
It is the job of Orion Knox and Sue Moss to chart that history. They're going over the ship stem to stern to document her past, learning secrets the Texas has carried with her for more than 70 years.
We find history about the people that were on the ship. We have found magazines. In a few compartments there have been pinups found, which was interesting. I did not realize that they could get away with that sort of thing, but apparently they did.
But there are other things that only the ship can tell us.
Doing a good job of it and not doing a haphazard job, that we're talking about probably 10 years.
There may not be that much time. The Texas is badly in need of repair. Rust and corrosion are her enemies now. Naval architect Ed Phillips has examined just about every square inch of the ship, and he knows firsthand how serious the problems are.
We're 8 feet under the surface of the water here. The floors, beams, and particularly the webs in this location at the foot are fairly substantially wasted.
Some of the biggest problems the Texas has are the pipes that run through the hull. They're leaking.
This runs all through the ship, and it is shot, a source of substantial of our lower compartment flooding.
Another potential hazard lies near the very bottom of the Texas, just above the keel.
The structure is completely corroded through. We have cracks running from one lightning hole to another. This frame has collapsed. The side is moving in. I consider that a casualty here, or a severe leakage, could occur most any time.
The topside hasn't escaped the ravages of time either.
The superstructure generally is in deplorable condition.
The bottom line is that if the Texas is going to survive, she needs major attention, and soon. The hull must be made watertight. The estimated bill for immediate repairs is between $6 and $10 million. How long the Texas will last, as she is, no one can say for sure. She sprang her most serious leak yet in May of 1986. Experts say she was within a few hours of sinking at her berth when the pumps finally brought that leak under control. The plight of the Texas has caught the attention of the men overseeing the battleships Massachusetts, Alabama, and North Carolina. These ships also have been turned over to their home states. They're all newer than the Texas. Paul Weitzies hopes the Massachusetts can avoid the problems the Texas has.
I see this ship perhaps operational 100, 200 years from now. I think it'll be better because it'll be older. And I think older is better when you're trying to show somebody history.
Many of those men who lived history on board the Texas came back in 1986 to see the ship one more time. Maybe the last time.
She was some ship, I want to tell you. Of course, it's the crew that makes the ship, you know.
We have just tremendous pride in the ship, the things that we did, and in helping to win the war.
And Texas was covered with pride. I remember it in the proud days that I served aboard, the beauty of it, the cleanliness, the outstanding people. Just say that you were on the Texas, you were head and shoulders above other people.
It's the only one in the world of its kind. There'll never be another one.
If something isn't done, soon, I don't think we'll have a ship to visit.
It breaks my heart to see the condition of the Texas today, and I would not have expected that of Texans. And I'll just be honest with you. I thought Texans were people of great pride. If they knew, just really knew what this ship had done for our country and for them, and knew the condition of this ship today, I believe they'd find the money to fix it.
I love the Battleship Texas. It brought me home safe.
If ever a ship deserved a happy ending, I think this one does.